You don't need to have a super expensive sewing machine or super expensive scissors or even super expensive fabric. You just need to be really considerate about the choices that you make. Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Today I thought it would be fun to share with you a few easy ways that you can elevate your handmade, hand-sewn garments. So recently I put a little poll up on my community tab asking whether or not you considered yourself to be a beginner or more of an intermediate advanced sewist of garments, and I think it was about 70-30, 70 being more in the intermediate and 30 being more in the beginner camp. But then I had a lot of people comment a little bit more specifically saying they were experienced with some aspects and not with others, and so I thought it would be fun and hopefully helpful to share with you a few things that I have learned in my years of sewing, things that have really helped me to elevate the quality and the finish of my handmade, hand-sewn garments. I'm not trying to judge anyone else. I'm going to use examples from my own personal sewing experience. I wouldn't even consider these to be failures or mistakes, but I've definitely made garments in the past that with wash and wear don't look the way that I want them to look. And so I have a few tips that I've learned along the way that have really helped me to create more professional, high quality, longer lasting, better looking garments. So if you're a complete beginner, I think these tips are really going to help you going forward to create garments that look really, really high quality, that last, that wash well, that wear well over time. And if you're more in the intermediate camp, maybe you know some of these things, but maybe some of them will be new to you as well, or just good reminders as we try to create our own handmade wardrobe. So I hope you'll stick around if you're new here. My name's Rebecca and I love making videos about sewing, knitting, all things slow fashion. So if those are also interests of yours, please do consider hitting that subscribe button below. And let's go ahead and get into easy ways to elevate your handmade garments. Okay, so the first one may sound simple or obvious, but I think is actually really important to talk about, and it impacts your garment sewing before you even begin, and that is your fabric choice. So I know a lot of people, beginner or otherwise, were looking for affordable fabrics, and so I want to make a note of this because it's something that I have created garments with inexpensive, kind of low quality fabrics and regretted doing so because the garment didn't hold up, it didn't wash well, etc. So I'm not saying that your fabric has to be expensive, definitely not the case, but there are a few things to pay attention to when you're choosing your fabrics that will directly impact your garment. So for instance, when I first started sewing garments, I didn't understand the difference between a quilting cotton and an apparel cotton. So I can show you a very clear and obvious example. I made this gray button-up shirt using a quilting cotton from Joann and using a free pattern. It was the fabricstore.com Noah shirt. This is one of the first button-up shirts that I made several years ago, and if you follow my content here or on Instagram, you'll probably know that since then I've made many button-up shirts, and I haven't made another one out of quilting cotton. So to show you a little bit of an example why this matters, the quilting cottons are really lightweight and they wrinkle really, really easily. After washing and drying, they look not great. With a quilt, when you've quilted the fabric and you wash it and dry it and it gets all crinkly, it adds so much to the texture of a quilt, but for a shirt, it doesn't work as well. Also, the fabric is quite thin, and so I found that it doesn't hold up very well, and the interfacing applied to it for things like cuffs and collars just starts to kind of crumple up with the shirt. So as I said, here's an example of a shirt that I made out of quilting cotton, and I think I can show you a picture that I posted when I made it where it actually looked okay, and then I can show you what it looks like after having washed it. It doesn't get worn anymore. It's in my little bin of scrap fabrics now, but I'm glad that I held on to it so that I could show you. And in contrast to that, I can show you a couple of other shirts that I have made with apparel, shirting cotton, with linen, with lightweight denim. As I said, I've made many a button-up shirt. All of these fabrics wash and wear so much better than a quilting cotton or even like a polyester blend. So fabric choice is really mostly about composition and weight. Another reason that fabric is super important is the weight. So depending on the project that you're making, the weight of the fabric will definitely impact whether or not it looks handmade or if it looks elevated and professionally made. And I know there's a conversation around all clothing being handmade. Maybe I should say homemade, but you know what I mean. You can tell when something is a DIY craft, and you can tell when something is handmade with skill. You know what I mean. A good example of fabric weight being really important is when you're making pants. So again, I have made pants out of a lightweight cotton before, which can be a thing if it's intended with the pattern, but I have used a lightweight cotton before to make pants that the silhouette and the style required a heavier weight, and it did not go well. And after washing and drying the pants, I didn't want to wear them again. Didn't hold up well. Everything crinkled and shrunk and didn't hang well on the body. And so I think it's really important when you're making something like pants or a jacket to pay attention to the weight of the fabric. Again, it may seem obvious to you if you've been sewing for a long time, but if you're buying fabric as a relatively new sewist, particularly if you're buying fabric online, you might think 100% cotton, great, I'm gonna make pants. But check the weight, check the GSM of the fabric. It's really, really important. And I can show you some examples again of things that I have made that haven't worked out. And also I can show you jeans that I've made with a 13.5 ounce cotton denim. They look a lot better. In a similar vein to fabric choice being really, really important for the final quality of your garment, I think it's also important to think about the other notions that go into your garment making. So buttons, for instance. Button choice is really, really important. If you use really inexpensive plastic buttons, which you totally can, and there's definitely a place for those, but if you use those on a garment that requires a more elevated finish, or on something like jeans where metal hardware would be much more appropriate, you see what I'm saying? Button choice is really, really important. I think the same can be said of zippers. If you use a really inexpensive, low quality zipper, it's gonna break, it's not gonna work smoothly, it's gonna make your garment look cheaper. And you know, these are things that when you're beginning, maybe you're not taking a lot of time to think about the quality of your buttons or how they're going to wear. Buttons in particular, if you have buttons on a shirt or on pants, every time you put the shirt on, you're touching them. It's really, really important to choose materials that are long lasting and that look elevated in order for the whole garment to look elevated. The same thing can be said of interfacing, right? It's something that we don't really think about. If a garment tells you to interface the collar or the cuffs or the button band, you may just go and buy interfacing without really knowing what you're doing and not knowing that there are lots of different weights of interfacing that could be suitable to different types of projects or parts of a garment. So in addition to fabric choice being super important, it's also really important to take time and consideration into the other notions that go into a project. Things like buttons and zippers and rivets, interfacing, you know, do some research, see what is best suited to your particular project, because they all require, every project has different requirements. So something to consider, something that may not be in the instructions necessarily. So yeah, choose a really good fabric. Pay attention to what's in the fabric. Is it cotton, linen? Is it polyester, nylon, right? Pay attention to the composition of the fabric, the weight of the fabric, and what weight the garment requires, how structured or lightweight the fabric should be. And then also really consider your buttons, your zippers, your interfacing, all the other things that go into the garment, because again, once you've washed it and worn it several times, you're going to see how well the materials hold up. I think a really good example of this, particularly for beginners, if you haven't experienced this yet yourself, is to think about fast fashion. Think about going in and buying a cheap shirt from H&M or something, and it might look really nice in store on the hanger, but then once you've worn it and put it through the wash, it's a very limp and crinkled and pilled, and the fabric itself changes so much. And when you go into a higher quality store and you buy maybe a very similar looking shirt that is made with better materials, it wears and washes beautifully. It gets better with time, as opposed to kind of falling apart. So hopefully that makes sense. I'm sure that it does. Again, I'll put some pictures up to give you reference points as I talk through this, but yeah, things to consider. In a similar vein to those things, I think it's really, really important to think about your thread color, your thread weight, and if your project requires top stitching in particular, I think it's really, really important to consider and be considerate of your thread color choice. So for instance, there are times when contrasting top stitching thread look really, really great. I particularly love when a dark indigo blue denim has a contrasting top stitching thread, so white or even a gold or a red. That looks really, really cool on denim. It looks intentional. You see designer brands using that, and that's a time when contrasting thread looks really, really good. However, I think that if you're sewing a project where you don't want to draw attention to the thread or the button, it's really important to match it to the fabric in order for the garment to look elevated, to not look like a home craft, but to look like a skilled hand-sewn garment. You see the distinction? If you have thread that contrasts with your fabric in an unintentional way, it doesn't look very good. So pay attention to the color of your thread. Honestly, sometimes when I'm sewing a project, I'll have a few different threads that I'm considering, and I'll take a little scrap piece of the fabric and just do a line of straight stitches of each of those colors next to each other to test it and see how the thread is going to work when it's actually sewn up. So that's another thing to consider. Also with threads, the thread that goes in the top of your machine and the thread that goes in the bobbin, if they're not the same color, it's very visible. And so that may or may not matter depending on the project, but if you're sewing with a thin, lightweight material and you want the thread to disappear, it's very important to put the same thread in both places. It can be fun to play with mixing that up if you're doing it intentionally, but something to consider if you haven't before. Another thing that is really, really important and that really makes a huge impact on how elevated your final finished garment looks is whether or not you're pressing or ironing before, during, and after pretty much each step of the sewing process. So when you first get your fabric from the store, it's really important to pre-wash it in the way that you're going to wash your final garment. And a lot of people are aware of that. When I first started, I was not. It's something that I learned, that if you don't pre-wash your fabric, your garment is going to shrink in subsequent washes if it's a garment that you're putting through the washer and dryer. Following that initial pre-wash, it's really important to steam or iron your fabric before you cut out your pattern pieces. Again, it may seem obvious, but if you're a beginner, maybe not. It's something to take note of. When the fabric comes out of the wash, it's going to be crinkly. It's not going to lay perfectly flat. And if you cut out your pattern pieces on a crinkly fabric, they're going to be misshapen. They're not going to be the exact size and shape that they need to be. And things aren't going to line up well. It's going to impact the look and how elevated the final garment looks. So after pre-washing your fabric, be sure to iron it before cutting your pattern pieces. Additionally, almost every time you sew a seam, you should be pressing or setting that seam. It may seem tedious, but ironing is a huge part of the garment construction process. And after stitching a seam, if you take the time to press that seam, to finish the edges of that seam, and then to press it in the direction you want it to be, whether it's towards the front or the back of the garment or pressed open, these things really make a big difference in how the final garment looks. For instance, on a shirt, if you press that shoulder seam towards the back, it sits flat and nice on the shoulder. If you don't do that, it's going to move around. We often top stitch these seams as well, but with trousers, for instance, they will often have you finish the front and back leg pieces separately and then press them open so that the side of the leg lays really, really flat and straight. If you don't take the time to do that, they don't look as nice. They don't look as polished or as elevated. And it matters that you do it while you're sewing as well as after you've sewn and washed the garment before wearing it. Truly, truly, ironing while you're sewing gives you a much more professionally finished garment than if you don't. And I know from experience. So take your time with it. You know, sewing our own clothing is such a rewarding practice, and it's so much fun to be creative and think of new ideas and try out different silhouettes. And I myself am guilty of getting caught up in the excitement and kind of rushing a project. And the ones that I rush, I don't end up wearing long term. I know from experience that sewing your own clothing by hand is a slow practice, and you can become efficient at it and produce things in a short amount of time that are really high quality. But particularly if you're just learning, if you're just starting out, go slow. Be really considerate about your fabric choice, the weight of the fabric. The notions that you use in your garments really do have a huge impact on the final look and feel of the garment. It's really, really important to press every step of the way. And having really good tools also makes a big impact. And I don't mean expensive tools, but things like a steam iron. I started with an iron that didn't steam. The steam part wasn't functional. I got a better iron that steams really, really well. It's really important to have sharp scissors, or if you use a rotary blade, that the blade is sharp, because when you're cutting out your pattern pieces, you want precise cuts, right? It makes the sewing better. You don't need to have a super expensive sewing machine or super expensive scissors or even super expensive fabric. You just need to be really considerate about the choices that you make. Be really intentional. Take your time, and everything is approachable. Honestly, you can make yourself jeans, you can make a highly, tailored jacket. All of these things are really, really doable. It just comes down to taking your time, going one step at a time, and being really intentional. And I think if you do these things and practice and, put love into the garments that you're making, you'll end up with really beautiful, long-lasting clothes that you will want to keep in your wardrobe for years and years to come. So those were a few things that I've learned along the way that have really, really helped me to improve the quality and the look and the feel and the durability of my garments. I hope that this was interesting and helpful to you if you're a complete beginner or if you're an intermediate sewist and maybe just hadn't considered some of these things. They are all things I have learned through experience, and so hopefully they help you to make beautiful clothing for yourself and others as well. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today. I hope you're all doing really, really well, and I will see you very soon in the next one.